Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sarah Untersey. I am the School Family Community Engagement Consultant here at Region 10 Education Service Center. And tonight we are lucky to have Dr. Peg Dawson with us. In over 40 years of clinical practice, Dr. Dawson has worked with thousands of children and teens who struggle at home and in school with weak executive skills. She's co-written numerous books on this topic for educators, mental health professionals, and parents. Among them, Smart But Scattered Teens, Executive Skills in Children and Adolescents, and Coaching Students with Executive Skills Deficits. Dr. Dawson is also a past president of the National Association of School Psychologists and the International School Psychology Association, and is a recipient of NASP's Lifetime Achievement Award. Dr. Dawson, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Okay, let's start fresh. I was muted. Okay, I'm delighted to be here. And let me just give you a little background to let you know how I get interested in executive skills. My background is school psychology, so I worked in the public schools for about 16 years and then joined my colleague and my co-author, a guy named Dr. Guare. We had a private practice for a while, and then we merged with a local community mental health center. So the Center for Learning and Attention Disorders is actually part of Seacoast Mental Health Center in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. My interest in executive skills came about as I made that transition to working in a clinic setting, because a lot of kids who were referred to me were referred because of questions about possible attention problems. And as I worked with those kids more extensively, I pretty quickly realized that the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic criteria for ADHD, which is problems with attention or problems with hyperactivity, impulsivity, or both, really didn't begin to describe the problems I saw these kids having. I saw huge problems with planning and time management and organization and those kinds of things. And I remember talking to my colleague Dick about it at the time. Now, he and I both did our doctoral work at the University of Virginia, although we were there at different times. But he went on to do a postdoc in neuropsychology at Children's Hospital in Boston. So as I was describing those issues, he said, well, Peg, those are executive skills. Well, this was the late 80s, early 90s, and people were not using that term much in those days. So he and I decided we really wanted to understand these skills better. What are they? How do they develop? What's going on in the brain? How do they impact school performance? And most importantly, how do you help kids with weak executive skills become more successful students? So that's what led to our writing. We wrote a book for professionals first called Executive Skills in Children and Adolescents. And then we realized there was a huge role for parents in all of this. So that's what led us to write Smart But Scattered and later Smart But Scattered Teens. We have several books in that series. Now, at the same time I was doing all of this, I was raising two kids of my own. I have two sons who are now in their 40s. But my older son at the age of 14 was diagnosed with an attention disorder. So I actually feel like a lot of what I've learned about executive skills, particularly on the intervention side, has come as much from my experience as a mom as my experience as a psychologist. And the nice thing about being the mom of one of these kids is you get the longitudinal perspective. You get to see what they look like when they grow up. I do a lot of parent presentations, and my message to parents all the time is most of these kids turn out fine. And I can almost, when I'm doing a live presentation, I can almost see the audience relax at that point. Because if you're at the early stages of dealing with one of these kids, it can look pretty daunting. You don't know what the future is going to bring. But you know what? Kids grow up, they mature, their brains mature. And if you use the kinds of strategies that I'll refer to tonight, but which are described in much more detail in our books, these kids really do have a good shot at success, which is why I enjoy working with them. Now, what I'd encourage you to do is I'm going to talk for about an hour and 15 minutes or so, and then open it up to questions. If you want to put questions in chat, that would be the best place to do it. I'm not going to monitor it while the presentation is going on because I'll get distracted by it. But we will review the questions at the end and just answer the ones that we can that seem relevant for the audience at large. So feel free to write questions in chat at this point. Okay, so Let me give you a quick introduction to the field. There's not a lot of consensus about executive skills, starting with the name. The more common name is executive functions. And if you want to know what the research says, you should type executive functions into an academic search engine. But my colleague Dick and I chose to call them executive skills for a very specific reason. And that was we wanted the emphasis to be on skills. You know, skill implies whatever level you're at, you can get better at it. The word function doesn't give me that same sense. When I think about function, I think, okay, it means use. And then I start picturing refrigerators or copy machines. Some people, a lot of people now combine the two and call them executive function skills. I'm happy with that because it keeps skills in the title. So what are these skills? They are brain-based skills. They're managed out of the frontal lobes of the brain, which is the part of the brain right behind the forehead. And this is really important, they take a minimum of 25 years to reach full maturation. So no kid graduates from high school with a fully functioning set of executive skills. And in fact, they get it well into their 20s before those executive skills are looking mature. And I'm talking about typically developing kids. So if you have a child, excuse me, with any kind of neurodevelopmental learning disorder or an attention disorder, it may take even longer than that. So there's also not consensus about the number of skills out there. The range I've seen is 1 to 33. When my colleague and I first started exploring the field, we started with this question. Sorry, I got something in my throat. Of all the skills that are out there that people are talking about, which ones are the most critical for school success? And can we define a pool of those skills that doesn't go overboard? Because part of our message is if kids aren't acquiring these skills naturally, we need to teach them. And I can't ask anybody to teach 33 skills. So we settled on 11. And let me see if that's what's coming next. Why is yes, these are the 11 skills that are the smart but scattered model, if you want to put a name on them. In the past several years, I've started dividing them into two categories, foundational skills and advanced skills. So foundational skills are the first skills to develop, and the order in which I've listed them there is the order roughly in which we think they emerge developmentally, starting from shortly after birth. It's somewhat speculative. No researchers tried to create an actual timeline. And some of these skills emerge almost sort of simultaneously, but this is our best guess of the order in which we think they emerge. With the advanced skills, those are later developing skills, and there the order of that list is more arbitrary, except for metacognition. We think metacognition is the last executive skill to emerge, at least in any kind of sophisticated form. And as you look at those terms out there, you could probably come up with a rough definition of each of those skill domains. But the one that tends to confuse people is metacognition. It doesn't, an automatic definition doesn't jump out at you. Actually, the throwaway definition for metacognition is it's thinking about thinking. And I'm not even sure what that means. So here's how I think about metacognition. And it's important. I think about it from a developmental perspective, because once kids acquire metacognition, their brains change fairly dramatically. They have a whole new set of cognitive capabilities that they didn't have when metacognition was more crudely developed. So here's my definition of metacognition. It's the awareness that you have thoughts and that you can use those thoughts to understand the world, solve problems, make sense out of things. Now, obviously, kids have thoughts from a very early age. When they acquire language, they think out loud. So we know what their thoughts are. But as they develop those language skills, they become internalized. We talk about internalized speech, and then thoughts go underground. So if we're trying to figure out what's going on in their head, we have to guess. So they have thoughts from an early age. What they don't have at an early age is the awareness that they can use thoughts as tools. Once they acquire that understanding, then kids can use their thoughts to develop all those other advanced skills. So you'll see a bump in those advanced skills as metacognition develops, because now they can use their thoughts to plan, to create organizational systems that work for them, to manage their time, and to set goals. Now, when I'm talking with parents or teachers of elementary age kids, my advice to them is focus on the foundational skills, because those are the first skills to develop. And if you put interventions in place to address those skills, and keep them in place long enough, and that's actually pretty critical because we tend to stop using interventions too quickly. But if you keep them in place long enough, you will see progress across elementary school, even with kids who are struggling. And so I'm talking about things like response inhibition or emotional control. Even if kids are struggling with those, if you put an intervention in place, you can see progress across elementary school. Now, if I'm talking with parents or teachers of middle school kids, what I say to them is, if you expect that by that age, middle school kids are proficient in those advanced skills, you must be pretty frustrated, because those, for most kids, those skills are just emerging at the middle school level. And what we know about emerging skills is they look great one day and lousy the next. Think about learning to ride a bike. You don't go from not being able to ride a bike at all to being able to ride 3 miles fluidly without falling off. There's a lot of falling down that goes in between those 2 points in time. And some practice sessions look better than others. And even into the first couple of years of high school, a lot of students are still feeling their way with these advanced skills. They're still trying to figure out how they work. And again, I'm talking about typically developing kids. And the one other point I make is, if you have a youngster with significant executive skill challenges, no matter what the age, middle, high school, elementary, whatever, focus on the foundational skills, because they're the building blocks for the later skills. And so as you're working on those foundational skills, you're actually laying the groundwork for the advanced skills as well. Okay, with that in mind, I'm going to go through the skills one by one, make sure we all understand what they are. And I'm going to give you some sense of what interventions we focus on if kids are weak in those various skills. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I don't have a whole lot of time tonight. And then we'll move into more general kinds of strategies. But I'm hoping you'll get a feel for each of these skills as I talk about them. And as I'm talking about them, you may also want to be thinking about your own kids and what skills are they stronger at, what are they weaker at? And you may want to be thinking about yourself, because what we found from first starting to work on executive skills in kids and then moving on to look at these same skills with adults, we found that it's very typical for adults to have stronger and weaker executive skills. It's also very typical for parents and kids to have different profiles. Although there's certainly a strong genetic component, you will find, since a child is inheriting genes from both parents, you will find that kids may look quite different than you are, or that your spouse is. So just keep that in the back of your mind as well. Okay, so response inhibition, first executive skill to develop. It's basically the ability to stop and think before you say or do something. And it is a very early developing skill. Some experts maintain that you can see the early signs of response inhibition in infants as young as 6 months of age. It's obviously very rudimentary at that point, because what a 6-month-old has available to it is respond, don't respond. It will look different in a 3-year-old, different in a 13-year-old. And as kids acquire language, they use language to support response inhibition. So if you hear a toddler saying to herself, no, don't do that, because she's heard a parent say that to her, she's using language to inhibit a response. Some experts maintain this is the most critical skill. If you don't get response inhibition, how are you ever going to get something like planning or time management? So the strategy we focus on to teach response inhibition, and is particularly applicable to young children, but I think it bears repeating at any age, is we teach wait and stop. If you can get wait and stop into kids, that's basically response inhibition. And there's some very natural ways that parents of young children do that. I'll just give one example from my own experience. I tend to collect these stories, but I'm thinking about when I was a kid, and I can remember my mother making me take a nap at an age where I didn't really think I needed to take a nap anymore. Now I have to say, I grew up on Cape Cod. My father was an oceanographer, and he spent 6 months out of every year out to sea. I had 3 brothers. We were all close in age. So that left my mother at home as a single parent of 4 rambunctious kids. And looking back on it, I think I was right. I didn't need a nap. My mother needed time to herself. And so that got her that time to herself. But I can remember lying down in the bed and she set a kitchen timer and she said, you can get up when the bell rings. What was she doing? She was teaching me to wait. Now, and if you think about it, there are childhood games that go back generations, if not centuries, that do the same thing. I mean, think about Simon Says or Red Light, Green Light, or we had a game when I was growing up called Mother May I. I mean, all those games require the kids playing them to listen to the instructions, process what they mean, and then make a decision. Are they going to act? Are they going to stop? Are they going to wait? And this is a really important skill to work. In fact, there's some research that suggests that the kids who develop response inhibition at an early age tend to have better life outcomes than kids who don't. So it's a good thing to focus on. When I think about focusing on response inhibition with teenagers, it still is worth talking about asking kids to wait. But there you can build in those conversations about how long can you go before you need to check your phone, or how much time can you spend on your homework before you need a break. All of that is sort of, can you wait longer and see if you can stretch out that time. Okay, so let's go on to the next executive skill, which is working memory. And by the way, the reason I should have said this earlier, the reason we call them executive skills is they're all the skills that are required to execute tasks. That's what they have in common, because they're going to sound pretty disparate here, but that's what they have in common. They're the skills required to execute tasks. Or as a 2nd grade teacher who took a class I teach at the University of Southern Maine every summer, she was trying to figure out, how do I explain executive skills to 2nd graders? What she came up with was they're the skills you need to get things done, which that's a perfect definition for it, because it's being able to accomplish things. Okay, so working memory is the ability to hold information in mind while you're performing a complex task. You know, if I want to stress this out in a testing situation, the easiest way to do that is to give kids a multi-step math problem, give it to them orally and ask them to solve it in their head. So there's a question off a standard IQ test that sounds like this: 8 birds are on the ground, 4 birds fly away, 2 other birds land. How many birds are on the ground now? If I ask a child that question and they do the first step and give me that as their answer, I'm immediately thinking, what's going on with working memory? Have they forgotten what the question is asking? Have they forgotten what step they're on? Now, that question also requires you to hold on to the precise numbers in the question and to pull from long-term memory into working memory 2 math procedures, addition and subtraction. So there's a huge working memory load to that one math problem. There is nothing that we ask kids to do that doesn't require working memory. You know, even sending them to their bedroom to retrieve a sweatshirt, they still have to remember why they're there when they get there. And I've done some work in schools for kids with dyslexia or complex learning disabilities. And what those teachers tell me is that working memory is the weakest skill for those kids. And so if this is a weak skill, then what that means is these kids are probably going to need cues, prompts, and reminders for far longer than we think we should have to give them. We think they should remember that, but they don't. And so one of my pieces of advice around strategies for kids with working memory is never rely, as much as possible, don't just rely on verbal instructions, because that's in one ear and out the other. Whenever possible, give kids a visual to help them with that. Emotional control is the next executive skill. This is the ability to manage your emotions in order to get things done. It may be the most complicated skill because although the brain is hardwired for these skills to develop, with emotional control, it's actually a complex dance between the internal hardwiring of the brain and the environment in which the infant finds itself. So an infant who's in the best position to develop good emotional control is one who by 7 months of age at the latest has a consistent, reliable caregiver who responds to his or her physical and emotional needs in an appropriate and timely fashion. And there's one additional ingredient, that caregiver is able to manage their own emotions well, because there's a mirroring process that goes on with emotional control. Kids learn to manage their emotions by watching how those around them manage theirs. There are good strategies for helping kids who struggle with emotional control, but I have to be honest, nothing works fast if a kid is really struggling with emotional control. But step number one with these kids, which is one we frequently forget to do, is just recognizing, acknowledging, naming their feelings for them. We tend to want to jump to reassure kids. I did a parent workshop last year at a school in North Carolina where a mom came up all upset at the end. She said, my daughter has significant attention problems. She's in middle school. She is so down on herself. She keeps saying, I am so stupid. I'm so stupid. And I keep saying to her, you are not stupid. And what I said to the mom was, recognize her feelings, let her know you understand what she's feeling. So you might say, wow, you sound pretty discouraged. It sounds like you're pretty frustrated. And mom looked at me like I was nuts. Like, do you really think that's going to make a difference? I assure you, kids, if kids know that you understand what they feel, then they can move on towards trying to solve whatever it is that's causing the emotions. The two longer acting, I should say, strategies around emotional control that we recommend, cognitive behavior therapy. That particular therapeutic approach is based on the understanding that our emotions are not caused by external events. They're caused by what we tell ourselves about those external events. So cognitive behavior therapy helps kids reframe it and tell themselves something different, rather than telling themselves, this is horrible, I'm in huge trouble, to say, okay, I understand how I got here. It's not the end of the world. So there are a whole set of strategies that go along with that. And then the other set of strategies that help with kids with problems with emotional control are mindfulness meditation techniques. And there are school-based curricula out there that often teach mindfulness. There are a lot of things parents can do. If you Google mindfulness for kids, you'll find all sorts of resources. One of my favorite resources for parents is a book called Sitting Still Like a Frog. And it comes with a CD with guided meditation. It is such a nice wind down before bed routine. So if you're looking for something that might help a kid relax and over the long term might help them manage their emotions better, then look at something like that. Okay, next executive skill is flexibility. So this is the ability to sort of roll with the punches, to be able to take unexpected things and handle them in stride. Now, I mentioned that my interest in executive skills came about through working with kids with ADHD, and kids with attention disorders have all kinds of executive skill challenges. Flexibility is not necessarily a challenge for them. In many cases, it is a strength. But there are kids out there who struggle with flexibility. And when I ask a professional audience, like teachers, like I did today, I asked the teachers, so what group of kids struggle with flexibility? The first answer I always get is kids on the autism spectrum, because that kind of rigid, inflexible thinking is basically a critical feature of autism spectrum disorder. But I think of flexibility as an executive skill that sometimes lies beneath the radar. I mean, we see the behavior, we don't realize it started with inflexibility. So if you have trouble dealing with unexpected changes in plans, what happens when they occur? Your anxiety level rises. So what we see is the anxiety, but it started with inflexibility. I also think about kids with oppositional defiant disorder. Now, with those kids, clinically, I'm thinking power struggles, control issues. They're refusing to do what we've asked. But if you step back and say, what was the trigger? What led that kid to refuse to do what we've asked? Very often it was because someone was asking that child to be more flexible than he was capable of being. And all he had was his behavior as a way of saying, I can't do that. The good news is flexibility can be taught. And there are some nice curricula designed to teach flexibility. One of my favorite being one called Unstuck and On Target. And although it's a school-based curriculum, the people who developed that have created all sorts of resources for parents as well. So if you go to their website, Unstuck and On Target, you can get access to some of those resources. They put together 3 to 5 minute videos, a whole set of them, on different kinds of issues, problems that inflexible kids have that parents have to deal with tips on how to handle those situations. So if that's your kid, then you may want to check out their website. Okay, moving on to sustained attention. Now, this one obviously is a critical feature of an attention disorder. There's a key phrase in my definition here, though. The definition is the capacity to maintain attention to a situation or task. And the key phrase is in spite of distractibility, fatigue, or boredom. And that's really important because I don't know how many kids I've seen over the years. Their parents have been nudged into my office by a pediatrician or a teacher because someone thinks their child has attention problems. And they will say to me, my kid can't have ADD. He can play video games for hours. Well, video games don't involve distractibility, fatigue, or boredom. So what I tell parents is, it's not that kids with ADD can't pay attention. It's that they have trouble making themselves pay attention. And that's not going to show up with video games. Where are parents going to see it? 3 places: homework, chores, boring daily routines like teeth brushing and taking showers. So there are a lot of strategies for helping kids with poor sustained attention. But the first one I always throw out is you got to start with where the kid is at. You know, if the kid has an attention span of 10 minutes and you give them a 30-minute task to do, it's not going to go well. So if you can break 30-minute tasks into 10-minute segments, build in breaks, preferably movement breaks, because especially kids with ADD, that's how they maintain arousal, energy, and alertness is by moving. So movement breaks work really well. And then see if you can gradually stretch that attention span. So you might say to your child, okay, you've got 15 math problems to do for homework. How many can you do before you need a break? And so you and the kid decide they can handle 5 and then they need a break. And so you go with 5 for a while, and then you see if you can stretch it. Okay, how about trying 6 before we take a break? So you're gradually stretching that attention span. Okay, let's go on to the next one, which is task initiation. So this is the opposite of procrastination. And I'm pretty firmly convinced that this is the last and hardest skill to acquire. I mean, I felt this from my own personal experience and from my clinical work. But also, if you type the word procrastination into an academic search engine, you will be hit with over 5,000 citations. So this is obviously a problem that people are trying to figure out and do research on. I haven't read all 5,000 of those articles, but I have read a number of them. And one of them gave me a developmental timeline for the development of task initiation, which matched my clinical experience. Now, again, I was talking about procrastination, which is a bad thing, right? And what this article said was procrastination increases until the mid to late 20s. And decreases gradually after that. Surveys of college students have shown that 86% of college students say that procrastination is a problem for them, and almost half of those say that it affects their grades. And those were pre-pandemic articles. I think it got worse during the pandemic when college students were trying to learn completely on their own over Zoom. But when I read that article, I remember thinking, man, we have got to figure out how to teach task initiation. If we could figure that out, we could increase college graduation rates. We could decrease the amount of time kids are spending in college and save parents thousands of dollars. And so I've done a lot of thinking about how to teach task initiation. And I have come up with an answer. It won't work in every case, but I've passed it along to many people, and I've heard back that it works for them in many cases. So here's how you do it. You teach kids to make a plan with a start time. And then you make sure they start the plan at the time they said they were going to start it. So it's Saturday morning. You say to your kid, what's your plan for cleaning up your bedroom? And the kid says, I'll do it right after lunch. Well, then your job as a parent is to be there right after lunch and to make sure your kid starts cleaning up his bedroom the way he said he was going to. Why is that important? Because the brain learns by association. So the more you can glue together 2 events, event over and over in time, then event A will trigger event B. Stated start time, actual start time. It's a variation on Pavlov's dog. It's probably the most famous psychological experiment ever done. The Russian psychologist named Pavlov rang a bell and presented meat to the dog, and the dog salivated. And after a fairly short period of time, Pavlov found that all he had to do was ring the bell and the dog salivated because he anticipated that the meat was coming. And so stated start time, actual start time, if you can link those two together, then it becomes habitual. Okay, so those are the first 6 foundational skills. So again, if you're a parent of a kid in elementary school, these are the ones to focus on. If you have a kid with significant executive skill challenges, these are the ones to focus on. They're the ones that develop first. They're the building blocks for the later skills. But on top of that, they lend themselves to easier interventions than the more advanced skills. You know, it's a whole lot easier to teach a kid to make a plan with a start time than it is to teach him to make a plan, which is the next executive skill. Planning is way harder. Planning is, okay, what is it I'm trying to accomplish? What materials do I need to accomplish it? What are the steps I need to go through to accomplish this, to make this plan work? What's the logical order for those steps? What's important, what's not important? All of that goes into planning. So obviously it's a more difficult skill. When I think about planning in a school context, I immediately think about long-term projects. Because that's where the rubber meets the road with planning. And I decided a long time ago that there's a mismatch between when teachers first assign long-term projects and when it is reasonable to expect kids to independently plan those projects. And I think most teachers understand that. So they break projects down into subtests and timelines and interim deadlines, and they shepherd the kids through the project and make sure they're staying on top of it. Which is totally developmentally appropriate, but it fails to take advantage of the opportunity to teach planning. So my message to teachers all the time is, rather than doing the planning for kids, can you do the planning with kids? Can you walk them through the process of breaking down a long-term project into subtests and timelines and interim deadlines, that kind of thing? Now, the other issue around long-term projects is usually when teachers assign them, they expect that kids are going to do them at home. So that puts the parent in the position of monitoring that long-term project, which can be a fairly significant source of stress for families. And in fact, many years ago now, a friend of mine found a picture on Facebook that captures it nicely. It's a science project, right? We all remember those. But the topic of the science project is, how much turmoil does the science project cause families? And it's set up the way a science project is. So on the left-hand side, you have the materials, at least one kid, at least one grudging parent, half-baked ideas of very dubious merit, and procrastination. And then in the center frame, you have the results section. You have this really nice graph showing yelling and crying on one axis and due date time on the other axis. And the closer the due date, the more yelling and crying that's going on. You have quantitative results. 75% of kids cry, 90% of parents yell, an average of 15 hours of family time is sacrificed. Findings: everyone hates the science fair. Sometimes when I'm doing a live presentation, parents will burst into applause at that point because they totally resonate to this. So if you want to work on planning separate from school, plan Saturdays. You know, get up in the morning on Saturday and say, okay, here are the things we have to do. Here are the things we want to do today. Let's make a plan for how that's going to go. So, and especially around planning fun stuff. That's a great place to start planning. Next executive skills, organization. Now, there's a key word in my definition here: the ability to create and maintain systems to keep track of information and materials. Again, so when I'm presenting before a live audience, I'll sometimes say, so what's the key word? People will guess different words. They'll say ability, create, systems. Well, that organization is my weakest skill. And so my response to that is, I am great at creating systems of organization. Every 4 weeks, I have to come up with another system for keeping my study clean because the last one didn't work. So obviously the key word is maintain. And if you have ever tried to turn a disorganized kid into an organized kid, you know this is a long-term labor-intensive process. Because it's not just a question of creating a system and handing it off to the kid and expecting them to run with it. Or since everybody's organizational system is somewhat idiosyncratic, it's not even a question of having the kid help you design the organizational system. So you might say to the kid, you know what, your backpack's a mess. You can't find your homework when you need to do it, and you can't find it when you need to hand it in. So let's take your backpack apart and put it back together in a way that makes sense to you. You still can't hand it off to the kid and expect them to to use the system. And I finally figured out why that is. And it's because at any single point in time, it is faster not to use an organizational system than to use one. It's way faster to take that science worksheet and stuff it in the backpack wherever than it is to take out the science notebook, open it up, take out the incomplete folder, homework folder, and open that up and put everything neatly in and neatly back in the backpack. Yeah, it may take longer in the long run, but in the moment, it's faster not to use that system. The one other comment I would make about organization is I talked earlier about how parents and kids sometimes have different profiles. When they do have different profiles, that can sometimes cause some conflict in the family. And one of the worst profile differences that I've seen, or the one that's most frustrating for parents, is when you have a highly organized parent with a slob of a kid. Because that organized parent really struggles with that kid being a slob. They can't even bring themselves just to close the bedroom door so they don't have to look at the mess. So my advice to those kinds of parents is you got to start small. Rather than having the child clean up their entire bedroom, having them keep the desk where they do their homework, having them clean that surface off after they finish their homework every night. And it's not like you abandon bedroom cleaning. I had a mom who said that she basically took masking tape and divided her kid's bedroom into quadrants, and were like 6 squares, and said, okay, your job is to keep that square clean. And she gradually increased the number of squares. I had another mom this past summer who had a very clever idea I wouldn't have thought of. She said when she was trying to get her daughter to clean her bedroom, she said, okay, there are 2 jobs for cleaning your bedroom. There's brains and there's brawn. Which do you want to do? And then she explained what each one was. So if they chose brains, that meant her daughter had to tell her what to do. She would be the brawn, she would clean the bedroom, but her daughter had to tell her what to do. Pick up that, put it in the laundry, pick up that, put it on the bookshelf. So, and then halfway through they would switch. Okay, now I'm the brains and you're the brawn. And so the child had played both roles. But what I loved about that strategy was if the child is just giving instructions for room cleaning, they're still learning how to clean their room. They're learning how to break down that big task into smaller, more manageable pieces. Okay, let's go on to the next one, which is time management. All right, so this is where we really see the earlier executive skills starting to show up again, because time management is basically task initiation, sustained attention, and planning. With one additional element that's unique to time management, and that is time estimation. The ability to estimate how long it takes to do something. And in my experience, people with poor time management, that's the piece that doesn't work well for them. They have trouble estimating time. And when I'm working with kids, more often than not, what they do is underestimate how long an effortful task is going to take. And then they leave it to the last minute and either run out of time, or if they're in high school or college, they're pulling an all-nighter to get it done. I do, though, see some kids who do the opposite. They underestimate how long a task is going to take, and then they don't want to start it because in their mind, it's going to take forever. And I realized this a few years ago. I had a mom of a 3rd grader who told me every night they fought about math homework, long knockdown, drag out fights about math homework. The kid could do math. That wasn't the issue. He just hated to do the homework. And it finally occurred to the mother, they were spending more time fighting about the homework than it would actually take him to do it. So she said to her son, how long do you think this math worksheet's going to take? The kid said, oh, it's going to take at least an hour. Well, that's a long time in the life of an 8-year-old. But the mom said, are you sure? Let's see if that's right. So they wrote down the time he started the homework, the time he finished. They did the subtraction. It was 10 minutes. The kid was stunned. He had no idea he could get his homework done in 10 minutes. And I think that is a skill that can be taught. So the next night, the mom could have said, remember last night you thought the math was going to take an hour and only took 10 minutes? Look at this worksheet. How long do you think it's going to take? Let's take a guess and see if you're right. So over time, kids learn to calibrate time more effectively. Okay, next executive skill is called goal-directed persistence. The way we think about it and the way we've defined it, this is a very late developing skill. Although you can see signs of goal-directed persistence in young children. You know, a 4-year-old who's putting a really difficult puzzle together and they are not going to stop until they get it right. That's what goal-directed persistence looks like at that age. But our definition, we're talking about longer term goals. We're not talking about things you can do by lunchtime. We're talking about, what's a marking period goal, or what's your goal for your summer vacation, or what are you planning on doing after you finish high school? So with that in mind, with those longer term goals, now again, you see how all the earlier developing executive skills factor in here. Because you can't just set a goal and forget about it. You have to remember it. So there's working memory. You have to have a plan for achieving your goal. So there's planning. You have to start and finish the plan. So there's task initiation and sustained attention. You have to resist the temptation to do all those other fun things you'd rather be doing than working on your goal. So there's response inhibition. And if that's irritating or annoying to you, then you also have to manage your emotions. So there's emotional control. As I say, I think this is a very late developing skill. This is the killer skill for middle school parents, because middle school parents expect their kids to have this skill by middle school. And in my experience, most don't. And I know that's what parents are expecting, because they come into my office and they say to me, doesn't my kid realize that how he's doing in 8th grade is going to affect what college he gets into in 4 years? And the short answer to that is no. They don't have that kind of time horizon. They haven't lived long enough to be able to picture 4 years out. And they don't know what college is. So they have this vague image of what they're supposed to be shooting for, and it's 4 years away. So I'm always preaching patience to parents of middle school kids. It'll come. And if you want to encourage goal-directed persistence, what we generally recommend is start with something the kid wants. Which was the mistake I made when my kids were in middle school. I was focusing on trying to get them to make the honor roll, or at least bring their grades up in some subjects. They weren't there yet. So if you can focus on something the kid wants, if they're into sports, they might choose a sports goal. Something that many teenagers want that require goal-directed persistence is they want their driver's license, they want a job. Both of those things have multiple steps and require you working overtime in order to achieve them. With younger kids, I think one of the best ways to encourage goal-directed persistence is to have kids save up money for something they want that costs more than their weekly allowance. Because then you can talk to them about how are you going to earn money? How are you going to save money? How are you going to resist the temptation to spend smaller amounts of money on something else before you've saved up for what you really want? So you can fit a lot of sort of goal planning and persistence just into something like that. Okay, and now metacognition, which is the last executive skill. I gave you one definition earlier. I think of it as being able to see the big picture, to put all the pieces of the puzzle together, the lights are going off here, to connect the dots. It's hard to talk about metacognition without using a metaphor, which is apt because meta is the same in both words. But if I were going to use more psychological terms, I would talk about self-awareness, which involves self-monitoring, self-evaluation. I think of it as this little voice in your head that's sort of monitoring what's going on in the moment, and it's sort of making sure you're on track. So have I built in enough time so I can finish this homework before bedtime? Am I going to be able to meet the deadline for my long-term project? Have I remembered everything that goes into that project? Or you get a test grade back and it's not the grade you were hoping for. So you say to yourself, I wonder what I can do differently the next time in order to bring my grade up. All of that is metacognition, and it is a late developing skill. You can encourage metacognition by having kids reflect. How do you think that went? The younger they are, the harder it will be for them to answer that question. And the other issue around reflection is that we often have kids reflect when things go wrong. So we say to them, you got sent in from recess 3 times this week. So what went wrong? What can you do differently the next time? And we forget to have them reflect when they have successes. Wow, you went an entire week without getting sent in from recess even once. You must have been using a strategy. What strategy were you using? And in fact, if you use that term with them, what strategy were you using? Just that strategy thinking, that's metacognition right there. Okay, so those are the 11 executive skills that we talk about with kids. And for the longest time, I was sort of stuck on these are the skills you need to be successful in school. And then it dawned on me, no, these are the skills you need to be successful in life. And part of my realization came from this cartoon. It's just about my favorite cartoon. The title of the cartoon is Dale's fourth grade education pays off. And the prospective employer is saying to Dale, the job you are applying for will require long division, state capitals, and cursive writing, which pretty much nails my fourth grade curriculum. But what I like about it is for this to be realistic, what would that employer be saying? The job you are applying for will require you to know planning, time management, organization, goal-directed persistence, all executive skills, and all higher level executive skills built on that foundation of lower level executive skills. This is the cartoon I use with algebra teachers when they say, wait, you want me to teach algebra and executive skills? I'm thinking, the job you're applying for, let's think about what skills people need on the job. And so I do talk with algebra teachers about, is there a way for you to weave in executive skills into how you teach algebra so that kids understand that these are important skills that go far beyond learning whatever algebra requires you to learn. Okay. So what I want to do now, good. Okay. I said earlier, these skills take 25 years to reach full maturation. I'm going to illustrate that. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I'm going to show you a series of MRI scans that were, they were taken by a neuroscientist at UCLA named Paul Thompson. And he brought kids in year after year, starting at age 4 until they turned 21. And once a year, he took an MRI scan of their brain. What you see there is what an MRI, a photograph or MRI scan of a brain looks like. So the key to understanding these images is the color. So an immature brain is red and orange. A mature brain is blue and purple. So you can see at age 4, there's nothing that's purple. What's blue is mostly around sensory input, vision and touch, because those are the first systems to develop in the brain. Now, if you look at that right-hand image, and that one's the easiest one to look at or to understand what's going on. The top part of that image, that's the frontal lobes, because the picture is looking down on the brain. And so you can, and frontal lobes is where executive skills reside. So you can see at age 4, that part of the brain is the least mature part of the brain. So I'm going to take you pretty quickly to age 21. And I want you to see how late in the process that part of the brain turns blue. It does not turn purple because full maturation is not achieved yet. The other thing to watch for, which is kind of fun, the brain matures from back to front. The back part of the brain is the most primitive part of the brain. The front part, the cerebral cortex, that's the most advanced part of the brain. Throughout evolution, that was the last part of the brain to develop. That's really the skills that reside in the prefrontal cortex are what set humans apart from animals, basically. So that right-hand image, the back of the brain is at the bottom of that image. The front of the brain is at the top. You will see the blue start at the bottom part of that image and travel up. Okay, so watch this. Okay, so there we are at age 21. There's a fair amount of purple on that brain, but not in the frontal lobes. And in fact, the text there says the 21-year-old brain is mostly mature, but the areas of green show that even at the threshold of legal adulthood, there is still room for increases in emotional maturity and decision-making skills, which will come in the next few years. So I want to bring you back to middle school, because I think middle school is the most challenging age. So that's age 13. Let's see here. Okay, so this is what the middle school brain looks like. The frontal lobes are mostly green. There's a lot less red and orange, but there's still, I don't see a whole lot more blue than I saw at age 4. So I pick on middle school in particular, because that's when kids generally start changing classes. And when kids start changing classes, they have to deal with multiple teachers. Every teacher has their own set of expectations about how homework is to be done, how notebooks are to be kept, how tests are to be taken, how projects are to be completed, how things are to be handed in. All of that the kids have to keep track of. Many schools use block scheduling, so kids have A days and B days they have to keep track of. A lot use rotating schedules, so first period on Monday is second period on Thursday, Tuesday, etc. I've worked at several schools in the last few years that had 7-day rotating schedules. So first period on Monday changes from week to week. These kids have complicated after school schedules and many are living in 2 homes. And we get upset because they forget something. We're asking their brain to do a lot of thinking at an age where, and a lot of, again, executive functioning at an age where they're really only halfway to maturity. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, one other point I want to make before I start talking about what do you do about this is I want to talk about the language we use to describe kids with executive skill challenges. This was a kid I saw twice. He was 7 the first time I saw him. He was one of the most hyperactive, impulsive kids I'd worked with at that point. He also had Tourette's syndrome, which means he couldn't take stimulant medications, which are often quite effective in helping kids manage hyperactivity, impulsivity, but he couldn't take stimulants. He managed to get through elementary and even middle school successfully. He had a couple things going for him. He had a mom who stayed on top of him, a mom who made sure he did his homework, who made sure he put it in his backpack, a mom who stayed in contact with his teacher so she could make sure he did everything he was supposed to be doing. And then he hit high school and he basically crashed and burned. I mean, he had failed 2 classes and he had D's in 2 other classes. So his mom called me after his freshman year in high school and said, I can't do it by myself anymore. I'm going to need help from the school. I'm going to lose him before he graduates. So I did an evaluation to provide the documentation that would enable him to access additional services. We actually got a coach for him. The school provided a coach. And I called the mom back a year later to find out how he was doing. And with the help of a coach, he had gotten C's in 2 classes and B's in 2 other classes. So he did significantly better. But as part of my evaluation, I asked the mom to find one teacher who knew him well to fill out rating scales on him. And this is just one piece of one of the rating scales she filled out. What concerns you most about this pupil? That he's lazy and not working to his potential. Please describe the best things about this pupil. He's sweet and has a good sense of humor, which describes just about every kid with ADHD that I've ever worked with, including my own son. But what I want to call your attention to are the negative terms that we use to describe this kid. Lazy, not working to his potential. Those sound like character flaws to me. Those sound like things that nobody feels like they have any control over, particularly the child in question. So here's my suggestion. And if you take nothing else away from tonight's presentation, then the next slide, please take that with you, because here's my plea. Instead of calling students this, lazy, unmotivated, not working to potential, disruptive, oppositional, messy, tardy, forgetful, absent-minded, or lacking a work ethic, how about we describe them as having challenges in task initiation, sustained attention, response inhibition, etc. All those negative terms on the left-hand side have a corresponding executive skill on the right-hand side. And by the way, each one of those negative terms has been used describing kids that I've worked with, either by a parent or a teacher or both. So this is the language that is frequently used. And so my plea to you is, chances are, if you're here listening to this presentation, I may be preaching to the choir, but you may know of people, relatives, or maybe even a teacher who uses some of those negative terms. So if someone says to you, your kid is really lazy, just gently say to them, you know what, I prefer to think of it as having problems with task initiation and sustained attention. And we're going to figure out strategies for that. We're going to help the child acquire those skills. It's a much more hopeful way of thinking about it. Okay, so with that in mind, what do you do? How can you work with a child with weak executive skills? So we basically have 3 strategies that we suggest for working with kids with weak executive skills. The first one is change the environment to reduce the impact of the weak skill. So you're not trying to change the kid at all. You're just trying to create an environment that's more supportive or less punishing. Second of all, teach the youngster whatever executive skill they're missing, or help them acquire that skill through coaching and practice. Or 3, use incentives to get youngsters, maybe they have an executive skill, but in the early stages of any skill acquisition, it's really hard and painful to use. So they'd prefer not to use that skill if they can get away with it. If you throw in an incentive, that may entice them to put in the work so they get better at the skill, because mostly what we're shooting for here is practice. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few examples. Let me start with environmental modifications. I seem to think in threes. So I think there are three ways to modify the environment. We can change the physical or social environment. We can modify the tasks we ask kids to perform, or we can change the way adults interact with kids. Let me give you a few examples. So changing the physical or social environment, we can manage distractions for them. We can turn off the TV during homework time. We can give kids a quiet place to work. The one thing I would point out, because over the years, I've had many parents say to me, could you tell my kid to stop listening to music while he's doing his homework? Because I know it's distracting. And my response to that is, actually, I don't know that it's distracting. There's some good research to show that when listening to music while you're doing some task like homework, actually, what it does is it screens out larger and more unpredictable distractions. So in many cases, the music can actually work to screen out other distractions. You may want to talk to your kid about the music they're listening to. My son with ADD said he could never listen to music with lyrics because he started paying attention to the words, but instrumental music worked for him. And here's the other thing I talked about the brain learns by association. Ask your kid to put together a playlist that he only listens to while he works, while he does homework, because then that music itself will cue him to start doing homework. It's a thought. Modify tasks, shortening them to accommodate short attention spans, build in breaks, create a schedule so kids know what's coming next, build in choice. Giving kids choices can sometimes act as a motivator. Give advance warning when something changes. That's particularly important for kids who are inflexible, and kids who are inflexible also often have trouble with emotional control. So if the plans change this weekend and that fun thing the kid was looking forward to doing gets canceled, then giving them advance warning for that and coming up with a plan B that they can live with. Use visual cues rather than verbal nags. I talked about that with working memory. Here's my favorite example of that. This sometimes puts people over the top, but I'll share it with you. This was a schedule shared with me by a mom, a calendar, a parent workshop I did a couple of years ago. Well, it's almost 3 years ago now, 4 years ago. Her son went to a high school in Maine, outside of Portland, and had block scheduling and kept forgetting what subjects he had on which days. So she created a monthly calendar, and each month she filled it in for him. Here's your Monday schedule, here's your Tuesday schedule, etc. She went even beyond that to color code it. So classes that were Google Classroom managed, where assignments were posted on Google Classroom were in blue. If it was backpack papers, that was green. So she's got it color coded. She's got 3 different school schedules posted there. She's got 8 dry erase markers that she's working with. So I don't think I'm sure you could get the answer to this question. What executive skill do you think she's really good at? Clearly organization, probably planning as well. That may put some people over the top, but she posted it in a place where it was very visible to him. Before he left for school in the morning, she said, look at your schedule. And if she was worried that he would just eyeball it and not really pay attention, she would say, read me today's schedule, so that he had in his mind what classes he was going to have that day. So this is changing the way we talk to kids. This is just using specific praise. There's some pretty compelling research to show that if you can achieve a ratio of 3 positives for each piece of corrective feedback that you give a kid, that alone can change behavior. Now, I know it's really hard to do that. So I'm happy with 1-to-1. And there's some research to say that 1 positive for 1 reprimand can be effective as well. But it's not just the other tricky part of this is that there's effective praise and there's ineffective praise. And it's a whole lot easier to give ineffective praise. Nice job, great work. What a smart kid you are. That's not particularly helpful, and in some cases can be harmful. Effective praise is specific, so the child knows exactly what he's being praised for. I appreciate you loading the dishwasher without my having to bug you about it. You're praising two things there. You're praising the kid for loading the dishwasher and doing it without having to be nagged. So there are the other rules for effective praise. And the other one I like to call attention to is your brother was pushing your buttons, but you worked hard to keep your temper in check. What I like about that is maybe the kid ultimately lost his temper and beamed his brother, but you praised him for working hard, trying not to. And maybe the next time he'll work a little harder, and the time after that, he won't hit his brother. I like the way you thought about that and figured out a good solution to the problem. So there you're praising problem solving skills, which is, that can be applied in so many situations that if you catch a kid solving a problem, praise him for that because he can use that in other situations. Oops, sorry. That's my mnemonic device. My alarm goes off to remind me to charge my watch every night. Okay, teaching the skill. Whenever possible, if you embed the skill in a daily routine, the kid's going to do anyway. And then here are the steps. Embed it in a daily routine, list the steps in the routine, walk the child through the steps repeatedly, create a visual that outlines the routine, and then fade the prompts by having the child use the visual to follow the routine. If you have Smart But Scattered, chapter 10 of Smart But Scattered gives like 19 different daily routines that involve a lot of different executive skills. There's a routine for doing chores. There's a routine for getting a kid to practice a musical instrument. There's a routine for getting kids to control their temper. I mean, there's so many different ones, but it basically follows this formula. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples. One is bedroom cleaning. So this is a checklist for bedroom cleaning. And this was actually created by an occupational therapist in a school that I did some work in a few years ago. It was a residential school, and they decided they wanted to get kids to keep their dorm rooms clean. And so when kids moved in at the beginning of the school year, they had them put everything away so their bedrooms looked great. And they took pictures to show what a clean bedroom looks like. And then they turned it into a personalized checklist. So Jack was a kid who attended that school that year. Here's what I like about this. There are 10 things on that list. Now, for someone like me who's organizationally challenged, 10 things looks pretty daunting. But they've broken it into 4 pieces. My clean desk, my clean shelves, my clean bed, my clean floor. I can handle that. Each one of those has no more than 4 items on it. So there it is, the visual, the steps, the checklist. Another example, teaching kids to make study plans. And I've used this with teachers as well as with parents. With parents, what I suggest is, kids get home from school and they are toast. They need some downtime. So you can say to them, you know what, you've been sitting in school all day. I know you need to get outdoors, get some fresh air, run around. Before you do that, though, let's make a plan, because it won't take very long. So all they're doing is, it's like an expanded to-do list. They list the tasks they have to do, spelling, math, reading. And for each of those tasks, you ask them to estimate how long they think it will take. So what are we working on there? That's time management, time estimation. When will you start? We ask them to decide when they're going to start a particular task. That's the plan with the start time. That's task initiation. That next column, where will you work? That doesn't address a specific executive skill, but we added that in after reading all the research on visual imagery and mental rehearsal. What that research says is that if you mentally rehearse carrying out a task, especially if you use visual imagery, that increases the likelihood that you'll actually do the task, and it actually makes it easier to get started on it. So if we ask kids to answer those 4 questions, what have we done now? We have now identified a task. So let's say it's math that you think is going to take 20 minutes. You're going to start it at 5 o'clock and you're going to work on the kitchen table. So we've got this little capsule of math, 20 minutes, start at 5, and we've got them in a specific place. And then if you ask them to write down the actual start and stop times, that's a check on 2 things. Did they start when they said they were going to start? And did it take was their time estimate right? And then they check off done when they're done. Again, I don't think that would take more than 5 minutes. And then you send the kid out to play. And when it's time to start, they've already determined when they're going to start. You just remind them that, remember, you said you were going to do math at 5 o'clock. And then finally, incentives. So, and I know parents have wide-ranging values about incentives. And so, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I will just say, I'm pretty pragmatic. If a reward helps a kid do the hard work, and so they get in the practice, so they get better at the skill, then incentives to me are worth it. And on top of that, when you put an incentive after a task, you're teaching delayed gratification, which is another word for response inhibition. You're teaching the child to wait. You can have that, but you have to wait, and you have to finish your math homework before you get to do that. So that's where I come down on time in terms of incentives. Whenever possible, though, I rely on simple incentives. My favorite is giving the child something to look forward to doing when the effortful task is done. So talk with them about that fun thing they get to do as soon as they finish their homework. Alternating between preferred and non-preferred tasks. First work, then play is the language we use to encourage that. Build in frequent short breaks. If it's really hard for kids, then, it could mean working for 10 minutes and taking a break for 5 minutes. And then using specific praise can also be an incentive. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up. I'm just going to emphasize, I'm going to go back and sort of emphasize the strategies that I like the best, because I think you get the biggest bang for the buck. First of all, keeping tasks and chores brief or building in breaks. But I will say, let me put in a plug for chores here, because there's some, I just ran across a research study recently that said that asking kids to do chores helps them develop executive skills. I've often encouraged chores because I think they teach some really important life lessons that's important for kids to learn. One being, you're part of a community and everybody has to pitch in to make the community work. And number two, and I think this is as important as any other life lesson that any kid will ever learn, every day of your life, you're probably going to have to do something you don't want to do. And we might as well start practicing now. And chores is a great way to practice. Again, I talked about giving your child something to look forward to doing when the effortful task is done. Building in choice whenever possible. I know parents often say to me, so what I say to my kid is, math's the hardest for you, so you do your math homework first. That's fine, and that makes logical sense, but that removes all choice from the kid. So I would prefer to say, okay, you got 3 different homework assignments. What are you going to do first? What are you going to do second? Because that gives control of the kid. And let's say the kid always chooses to do math last, and that's his worst subject, and he runs out of steam and he does terrible, or he doesn't do it. So after you've let that go for a week or two, you can say to the kid, I've noticed that you're always leaving math until the end, and then you run out of steam. Can we experiment with this? Can we try for the next 2 days you doing the math first and see how that feels? Because now you've got some data to back you up. You've given the kids some leeway in terms of their choice, and they probably understand that they know they ran out of steam before math came along, so they may be more willing to try something different. Using lists and checklists as reminders, that's the visual cues rather than verbal nags. Building in routines, anything that becomes a routine takes less effort. I think about teeth brushing. We automatically brush our teeth before we go to bed because it's just part of our bedtime habit. So the same applies with everything else we want kids to get better at. How can we work with kids to get them to use their own executive skills? Ask children to reflect on their own performance, especially when they're successful. What worked for you today? Why do you think it worked? Use questions to get them to use their executive skills. My oldest granddaughter, his name is Violet. Somewhere before she was 2, I could see she was having some problems. She was pretty inflexible. And she got it from me. There's no question about it. Her mom handled her beautifully. So when there was an unexpected change in plans and Violet was going to fall apart, Marissa, her mom, would say to her, okay, Violet, let's make a plan. Let's make a plan for you. We can't do it now, but we get to do it later. Let's make a plan for how we'll spend the time between now and then. Or, you know what, we can't do that today because XYZ. So let's make a plan for something else we can do instead. Other questions, do you have a strategy for that? What's your goal? How long do you think that will take? All of those are questions which prompt kids to use their own executive skills. Other thoughts? Now, this is one that I can never say with a straight face because this never worked with me. When problems arise, particularly with teenagers, when problems arise, share your observations in a non-judgmental way. I noticed that what can we do about that? I mean, I just have to laugh when I think about it because teenagers is so good at pressing our buttons, right? And then we react and get angry. Here's the interesting thing about the teen brain is the teen brain is primed for emotionality. Anything can set them off much more so than when they're younger or when they're older. So it's part of the physiology of the brain at that point. So what that means is that if a parent can contain their emotions, they are far more likely to have a reasonable conversation and get a reasonable outcome from their kid than if they lose their cool. The kid is going to lose their cool too. Remember that whole mirroring process around emotional control? Well, it's particularly applicable with adolescents. So you can say, I noticed we had a problem with that this morning. What do you think we can do about it? Brainstorming strategies, don't jump to offer a solution, but say, let's think about some possibilities here. And then, ask the child to pick one that they want to try and make a game plan for it. Keep your eye on the biggest prize, which I think is building goal-directed persistence. I mean, that's really what we want kids to have, right? You can model this yourself. In fact, that's how I managed to survive both my kids in middle school when I thought they had no goals in life. And I kept telling myself, you know what, they have two parents with really strong goal-directed persistence. And we're modeling that when they reach an age where they're ready to set goals and try to achieve them, they will channel that. And that absolutely happened with both my kids, different ages for each one. My younger son happened in high school. I could see what he wanted to do and he was driven to do it. My older son, the one with the attention disorder, probably took until age 25, but it definitely paid off. Help them set their own goals. And they can even be little goals. Praise effort. Wow, you stuck with it. You figured it out. I can't believe how hard you worked on that. And emphasize your child's goals, not yours. Okay, be patient. Your child at 15 will not look the same at age 25. I'm going to use one of my sons as an example. This was my younger son at age 15. That's Isaac. He went through this period. I mean, he had multiple haircuts when he was in his teen years. That was my least favorite. Really all gelled up mohawk. So that was him at 15. This is him 10 years later. Actually, he looked like that at 19. He did not go to college. He got a job in computers immediately after he graduated from high school. And very quickly, he was having to put on suits and go into hospitals and talk with them about computer security. So it only took like 4 years for him, I would say. But I'm always preaching presence. You really cannot predict based on what your kid is like at age 13, 14, 15, that what they're going to look like when they're 23, 24, 25, 26. Okay, I think. Oh yeah, before we get to Q&A, I just, very often I throw these things out. I never know whether people can use this information or not, but every once in a while I'll get an email from someone who says, oh yeah, I used your workshop. This was one, a mom in Guelph, Ontario, actually, where I did a workshop a few years ago. And she sent me this email afterwards. She gave me permission to use it. And here's what she said. I already used some of the tips you offered regarding emotional control of my daughter last night as we worked on her language assignment. We set the timer, took breaks, got a drink of water. And when she really started to freak out, I asked her to make a plan and thought of your daughter-in-law and smiled. Estimating how long it would take to do the assignment and then doing it in less time than she thought made my daughter feel so proud. When it was all done, I praised her ability to self-regulate and her effort to stick with it even when it wasn't going the way she wanted, especially when I too wanted to freak out, yell, and quit. Smile. So that's one. I've got another email from, this was a teacher I worked with, but she was writing about her daughter who was in middle school at the time. And here's what she wrote. She said, I can't see it all. Just tonight, my daughter needed help on an assignment. When she showed it to me, it was obvious that she knew how to do it. She just didn't like it, thought it would take too long and wasn't sure how to get started. Thank goodness, she says, because I know way more about breaking down an assignment than I do about the agricultural revolution, which apparently was what the homework assignment was about. I gave her a couple of strategies. Work for 20 minutes and then take a break. Do what you know and skip the hard parts. About 15 minutes later, she was done with all her work. Sometimes the strategies seem like stating the obvious, but they are powerful in their simplicity. Ingrid Conklin was the name of the teacher who sent me that email. So I think little things can actually be very effective. And now, sort of right on cue, I'm ready for questions and answers. And I don't know whether you can see the words here, but this is an old New Yorker cartoon, and the title is The Big Book of Parent-Child Fights. And what I like about it is on page 1 is the first chapter, Food Arguments, and the last chapter is chapter 12, Miscellaneous Battles, and that's on page 9,505. So I don't know if you've been tracking. Okay.
We have a few questions, and I'm not going to turn on my speaker so that it doesn't interfere. But we have a question that is, I've used your language to try to empathize with my 8-year-old, but she always feels patronized. Help.
Okay. Do you think they could hear that, or should I repeat
Go ahead and repeat it.
Okay. So I've used your language to empathize with my 8-year-old daughter, but she always feels patronized.
Yes.
Well, I would reflect that back to her too. Wow, it sounds like you feel like I'm patronizing you. I would throw it back to the kid in terms of, tell me how you'd like me to talk to you. Give me some ideas. Or in fact, Dick was working with, or actually had a friend who's the woman taught at his wife's, the same school his wife taught at. And her daughter at one point gave her mother 3 different ways that she could react to her, depending on what the daughter is in the mood for. So I would probably turn it back. If the child is actually using that term at age 8, she's probably a pretty bright kid. So I would talk to her about, okay, let's straighten this out. I don't want to patronize you, but I also want to help you understand that I think I know what you're feeling. I understand what you're feeling, but you tell me. You could have the kid rate afterwards. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how did that comment work? and maybe they can shape your response to it till it reaches a point where they're happy with it. Okay, next
question is, what book helps with emotional control?
Okay, what book helps with emotional control? Oh, okay. So one of my favorite books, I think it's in a 2nd edition now, is The Explosive Child by Ross Greene. And it is written for parents. It's talking about kids with huge problems with emotional control, but it basically talks to parents about how you decide to respond to the various upsets that kids may have. And he talks about 3 buckets. You know, one bucket is safety or health issues where you have to impose your will even if the kid is pushing back. Another bucket is this is not a fight worth having. I think of one example of a mom who told me that her husband was really insistent that her son had to get a certain haircut, and there was no leeway on that, had to get a certain haircut. And that's one I would put in that other bucket of, I'm not sure this is a battle worth having. You can see I gave up on that battle with my son. And then in between those 2 are the ones where there's room for negotiation. And so you learn how to negotiate, you learn how to talk through disagreements. So I would start with that book. If anybody knows of any other books that they recommend, put it in chat. So that other people could, they don't see chat, do they?
I think they do, because
we've
we've
had
had a few chats.
Okay, good. Okay.
How can I help my teen cope with her anxiety when it comes to her wanting to go and visit old teachers? So anxiety.
Okay, anxiety in terms of wanting to go visit old teachers, but being nervous about it?
Maybe.
Yeah, it's a little hard to. So, I tend to be anxious in new situations myself. And I remember a few years ago reading, it was one of those, quotes that you find online or something like that, but it really had an impact on me. It said, do one thing every day that scares you. And I thought that was, it's not that I follow it necessarily, but it's just, that's sort of reassuring that, if you can take that as, it's scary, but it's and then talk about it. So if you can get your daughter to the point where they're willing to do this scary, anxiety provoking thing, and then talk to them afterwards about how did you feel about that, and then even again so how are you able to do that? How did you overcome your anxiety in order to be able to do that? So you can then go back and say, so the next time, maybe you can use that same self-talk or that same strategy. There's a good book, though. I'm not sure this is relevant in that particular case, but for the parents who are dealing with anxious kids, there's a great book called Anxious Parents, Anxious Kids, or Anxious Kids and Anxious. It's by Lynn Lyons, who's a therapist who actually in New Hampshire, but she's nationally known, presents all the time. And she has some really good thoughts about helping kids manage anxiety. And they're somewhat, I won't say they're controversial, but they're somewhat counter to very often we're trying to alleviate kids' anxiety and trying to help them feel as comfortable as possible. And her thing is, no, we're all going to feel anxious. We got to figure out ways to help kids manage the anxiety in the moment as opposed to trying to alleviate the anxiety. So Lynn Lyons is the author. Go to Amazon and you can track that down.
Okay. This is the last question we have. So if anybody has any more, they can put them into the Q&A. This is for an 8-year-old that has some working memory issues. And the mom is asking that even if he's done something multiple times, does that mean he's still going to need that cue or prompt when working a math problem? Because she's saying that sometimes while he's working on schoolwork, she knows he knows some of it, but he seems to need help and she can't figure out why. And it makes her think that maybe he just doesn't want to do it, but maybe she's wrong.
Okay, so this is a question about around working memory with a child who has done a procedure like math multiple times, seems to know the procedure, and yet in the moment he feels like he's not following the procedure, and she can't figure out, does he not know the procedure, or is he choosing not to do that? That would be an interesting conversation with the kid to have. So let me get this straight. Are you struggling with this because you don't want to do it or because you can't remember? So if you have that conversation in a way that the kid isn't feeling attacked, he may be able to answer that question. And in some cases, it may be one, and in some cases, it may be the other. One of the ways to help kids with weak working memory, especially around math, is give them a model problem to work off of. So if they're learning to do subtraction with regrouping, you give them a model problem that does a subtraction of the regrouping problem and maybe color codes or numbers the steps. So the kid, if that's what his homework is, the answer is not there, but the procedure is there and he can follow the procedure step by step because you gave him a model problem. And I guess the other thing to say is that, and this is something we should all be aware of, that when we're anxious, our working memory goes out the window. So our working memory diminishes the more anxiety we feel. And so that may be going on with this kid as well. Yeah, he understands the math procedure, but now he's getting anxious because he's afraid he's going to make a mistake, or he's afraid someone's going to yell at him because he got it wrong. So if there's fear in there at all, then whatever working memory he had is diminished as a result of that. So, alleviate the fear by giving him a model problem or talking him through it, or just, just being patient and just saying, okay, so I'm going to assume you don't know how to do this. So let's walk it through. The one other thing I would say about that, though, is because there are kids who become overly dependent on parents or teachers or someone else to either do the work for them or support them while they're doing the work. So you can wean them off of that by saying, okay, we'll work on this together until the last step, and then you can do the last step by yourself. Or I'll get you started. We'll do the first one together and then see if you can do the next one by yourself. So if you can see, give them a piece of responsibility, but let them know that you're there for the rest of it, and then gradually give them more and more responsibility.
Okay. That is all of the questions that we have right now in the chat.
Okay, well, we will get you the PowerPoint, and actually there are a few more suggestions in the PowerPoint, which I think are fairly. So I take a number of the executive skills and have different tips for each executive skill. I don't include that because I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but that piece will be in the tips for working with teenagers, and then strategies for building executive skills. So all that is there as well. So Okay, well, thank you everyone for taking time out of your evening to attend this, and hope you get something out of it.
And thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time.